Hello, my name is Michael Tesoro, and I want to wish everybody a happy new year and a Merry Christmas. Hope people have had a good break. And this is the first presentation for 2024, and in it I'll be seeking to summarise everything that happened in relation to ACCC in December 2023. And needless to say, it was a very busy month for the ACCC in a number of fronts, so it's going to take probably a little bit over 35 or so minutes to summarise everything that happened. And that little gift that I found about the cheating robot is, I think, shows robots can cheat just as humans can. Now, a bit of background about myself. I'm a competition consumer law, and I've been running my own practice to Sarah Lee Consulting for 16 years, and I help companies, individuals with competition and consumer law matters. Prior to that, I worked at ACCC for 15 years in a variety of roles, including in enforcement and mergers. Now, the outline's quite lengthy. There's a lot of activity in courts, enforcement action, mergers, a little bit less in scams. A lot happened in inquiries and consultations. A guideline was issued, a warning was issued, some legislative changes were discussed, one speech and one other. So there's quite a bit to go through. Now, there were 4 cases handed down. Actually, Tektronic was handed down on the 30th of November, so it really should have been last month's summary, and 3 other cases. And the interesting thing about all these cases was they were all settled by consent. So all the companies accepted the ACCC allegations, agreed on a penalty, and the court ordered the relevant penalty. So I think it's showing the ACCC case selection is quite strong. They're choosing cases that they can win, and they've put together some pretty strong evidence about the conduct. The first case was Tektronic, which is an exclusive distributor, I think, in Australia of the Milwaukee branded products. It also sells other power tools in Australia, and the product that raised concern was Milwaukee because they entered into resale price maintenance agreements in relation to that particular brand. It's a pretty schmick brand, I understand, in the area, and they entered into RPM agreements with 97 different retailers and dealers where they restricted their ability to sell below a specified minimum price. And it wasn't just an agreement to not sell below a specified minimum price. They actually did enforce this RPM agreement on a number of occasions. So as you can see, 29 occasions they actually enforced the agreement by sending warning letters, and in 2 occasions actually withheld supply. So it's pretty serious conduct, and they consented to a penalty of $15 million, which is actually the biggest penalty ever awarded for RPM in Australia. The next case involved Fitbit, and this was some breaches of the consumer guarantee provisions, and there was a sample of 58 consumers to demonstrate what they were doing wrong, but realistically there were many more consumers who were likely to have been misled. The first group were 40 consumers who were told that they had no right to a refund because Fitbit's 2-year warranty period expired. So obviously that's incorrect. Particularly for Fitbit watches, which can cost a bit of money, they're going to have to last more than 2 years. The second related to 18 consumers who were told that they couldn't get a refund unless they'd returned their Fitbit within 45 days, which is again clearly incorrect. So it's interesting, they paid $11 million, which is not very much, I think, given how blatant these breaches were and the size of Fitbit. I'm not too sure that's going to achieve any specific deterrence, but I guess the important thing here is they admitted the breach, and as you can see in the bottom there, they actually apologised formally through the court process for their conduct. So that's significant, apologising to consumers for your conduct. Now, another case involved Honda, and this case, when it was filed, it sounded a bit strange to me, but it was quite serious conduct. What happened here, Honda changed its selling model in Australia to sort of on consignment type situation. So that meant they cancelled a number of dealerships, and that was totally okay. They were allowed to do that. But the problem was, in relation to some of the dealerships, they sent representations out by text to consumers saying that a number of the former dealerships no longer serviced Honda vehicles. So the 3 dealerships involved were Brighton, Tynan and Buick. And as you can see, the little extract of the SMSs they sent out to remind people that the car was due for service, and the previous service dealer, those 3 dealers, no longer did service of the vehicle, so they should come to Honda. or another approved dealer. So that was clearly very damaging conduct to the three companies, clearly false. So they were fined $6 million, again by agreement, by consent. The next one was Airbnb, and this related to, well, it must have been a glitch on their system, whereby they were advertising accommodation in Australia without specifying whether it was Australian dollars or US dollars. And as it turned out, for a number of properties, it was actually US dollars, but Australian consumers didn't realise. So they're contracting to get accommodation, thinking that it's Australian dollars, turns out to be US, and they end up paying a lot more after exchange rates. So they admitted that they made this error, and there were 70,000 consumers who were actually charged in US dollars when they believed they were being charged in Australian dollars, and they consented to paying $15 million in penalty. I used to do the independent reviews of the Airbnb compliance program, so I'm a bit disappointed that this occurred, but it did occur after I finished my role with them. I think the frustrating bit here is they received 2,000 complaints about the issue from Australian consumers, and it doesn't appear to me they acted on those very quickly, and that resulted in a number of those consumers probably going to the ACCC and the proceedings being commenced. So it's very important when you get complaints to action them quickly and thus forestall any ACCC enforcement action. And as you can see, there's $15 million of penalties, but also $15 million worth of compensation likely to be paid to consumers. So I guess that's a good, quick outcome which the ACCC has achieved there. In terms of just enforcement, the first involved another alleged breach of the Horticulture Code. This involved Get Fresh merchants, and they paid infringement notices of $43,150. That's 3 infringement notices. And the breaches there were fairly significant, really, because they didn't have horticulture produce agreements, which is sort of an essential thing to have if you're going to participate in this market. They also failed to post the terms of trade. So they're pretty fundamental mistakes. Suggests to me this company really didn't understand the Horticulture Code at all. And the way the ACCC discovered it was after conducting compliance checks on their website. So it's pretty easy investigation for the ACCC. The next involved the button battery area, and there was 3 companies who were issued with infringement notice for breaching the standard. And the interesting thing here, it wasn't what usually is the issue with button batteries, which is a failure to ensure the enclosure area for the batteries is secure. Rather, this related to the safety warnings which are required to be put on the product. And under the standard, they're required to be on the product. But what the company did here, which is innovative Mechatronics Group, was they had a QR code on the product which people could scan and then go to a website and see the warning, and that doesn't comply with the code. So again here, a series of infringement notices issued, and again the ACCC dealing with these things in a sort of a quick, efficient way, not necessarily going to court and litigating these issues. Delicia Franchising got in trouble for some contraventions of the franchising code, and this is interesting because it was a few years ago that it occurred that apparently their annual marketing fund statements for 2020 through to 2022 did not provide sufficient detail of what they'd spent the money on in the marketing fund, and also they weren't provided within this 30-day period from the end of the financial year. So they're pretty fundamental breaches of the franchising code. But again here the ACCC resolved it with an infringement notice of $11,000 and a Section 87B undertaking, which is, I think, a good outcome, because I think Delicia doesn't look like a huge franchisor. Again, there might be some ignorance of their obligations, administrative problems or something along those lines. So I think it's a good outcome rather than litigating against a relatively small business. The next case is a big case, Emma Sleep and its 2 subsidiaries. And Emma Sleep is a very big German company involved in the sale of mattresses, and it runs a few different brands in Australia. And it was taken to court for some misrepresentations about the price savings that could be made on its products. And there were 2 fundamental or central allegations made. The first was the old was now pricing, that they had strike-through prices with discounts, which said that the product had been reduced from a previous higher price, but the ACCC's alleged that those products were never sold at the higher prices. The second one's interesting. It's a bit of a dark pattern when you think about it. The use of these countdown timers, so they've got a product that's discounted, they've got a countdown, creates this sort of urgency heuristic where you're trying to buy it before the countdown gets down to zero. And what actually occurred in this case, as alleged by the ACCC, is when the countdown timer got down to zero, it just reset at the same price. So it was a false representation about the urgency with which people had to purchase the products at the lower prices. That'll be an interesting case to see how it pans out, whether Emma Sleep contests it or taps the mattress. The next case involved Australia Post and Star Trek, and it's an interesting case because the companies again admitted that they engaged in misleading conduct, and this was related to a failure to honour compensation requests by customers for products which were lost or damaged in transit. And it's been occurring for a number of years, like all the way from 2018 to 2022, so 4 years worth of conduct. And as you can see, a lot of customers were impacted, about 11,000 customers in total. And I guess the saving element of this matter that probably prevented some litigation is the fact that there used to be this exemption in relation to these products prior to October 2018. That changed, and it seems that Australia Post didn't properly implement changes to its system to account for those changes in the legislation. So that might have meant the ACCC decided to take an administrative undertaking and a Section 87B undertaking rather than take them to court. And the total compensation likely to be paid is about $3 million. The last one here is the Crusader caravans, and the ACCC's been talking a lot about caravans for a few years now, so it's inevitable there's going to be a case. And this was an interesting one because there was representations made by the company in various brochures that their caravans were waterproof, when in actual fact they're only water resistant. So I think that's probably quite a significant representation to make. I guess if a caravan's totally waterproof, it's probably worth quite a few dollars more than one that's just water resistant. But again, here they resolved the matter through an undertaking and a payment of a infringement notice of $11,000. So you can see the ACCC has been very pragmatic and I think sensible in the way it's resolving cases. You don't want to clog up the courts with litigation against smaller players. You want to really be reserving that for bigger companies causing a lot of detriment. Now, the mergers activity was very active in December as well. There was the Coles-Saputo merger, which earlier the ACCC had expressed some concerns about, and then I guess it now concluded that it wasn't going to lessen competition. And this involved Coles buying 2 processing plants from Saputo and becoming effectively a processor. And the ACCC concluded it was unlikely to lessen competition, that the majority of these 2 facilities was already contracted to Coles, so it's basically making milk for Coles anyway. Also, Saputo, and the concern was by dairy farmers that Coles would no longer be obviously buying their milk, and Saputo may not buy their milk, so they got a lesser number of processors to buy their milk. But as you can see, the ACCC concluded Saputo had a commercial incentive to continue selling Devondale milk, so that means they're going to continue buying dairy products. Other dairy companies such as Lactalis and Bega will continue to buy raw milk, so there's other purchases of milk. And while Coles may have had an incentive to consolidate some of its milk volumes in the eastern states, that was not likely to lead to substantially lesser competition. So Coles deciding to buy from less suppliers of milk wasn't necessarily going to lessen competition. And finally, interestingly, and this is a counterfactual type argument, Coles's commercial incentives to consolidate its milk supply would exist with or without the transaction. So if it's going to consolidate its milk supplies, it's not a consequence of the transaction necessarily. So that can't be counted against the transaction. So that was signed off. I don't think the dairy farmers or the Farmers Federation like this very much. They're very concerned about the big retailers vertically integrating into processing. The next one was the Rye Hotel, and this is an interesting one because initially the ACCC expressed some pretty strong concerns about Endeavour buying Rye, and this related to the Mornington Peninsula. And it appeared that Endeavour Group and Rye were the 2 major competitors in the market, but what I think the market inquiry showed was that Rye Hotel was not really a very strong competitor. As you see there, it did not compete strongly on price or range, and mostly attracted convenience customers. So I think what it's saying here is that effectively there was going to be a lessening competition, but it wasn't going to be substantial. They weren't really a mover and shaker in the liquor market in terms of competition. And as you can see, they also noted that there were some other suppliers where customers could go to, so that should restrain the merged entity from putting up prices. Some Thirsty Camel branded stores in Peninsula Cellars and I can't pronounce that, the next fine wine cellars. And as you see, the ACCC, they effectively say that in a finely balanced assessment, the ACCC found that the unique circumstances meant that the transaction is not likely to, and I think they should have put this in bold, substantially lessen competition in the market. So they were nervous about it. It's a 50-50, but I think what they're saying here is they didn't have the evidence to formally block it in court. If they sought to block it in court, they probably would have gone down. So it's a sensible call, in my view, by the ACCC. The next one was the Woolworths Petstock merger. This is a very interesting one. I think I predicted this one was going to get through in my last presentation. And this is one where the ACCC discovered that Petstock had been acquiring businesses in this market for many years without seeking any approval, telling the ACCC at all, and had likely contravened Section 50 of the Competition and Consumer Act. And so the first thing that happened, there was an enforcement investigation and a divestiture package. And it's a very extensive divestiture package. As you can see, there's like 41 specialty pet retail stores, 25 co-located veterinary hospitals, 4 brands and 2 online retail stores, including a big one, My Pet Warehouse. So there's a lot that has to be sold off. And what occurred here, they're just buying businesses, likely breaching Section 50 of the Competition and Consumer Act, not advising the ACCC of any acquisitions, taking out their nearest competitors, becoming the only provider of various specialty pet retail services in local markets. And then the Woolworths comes along, wants to buy them, and the ACCC realises what's been going on. So that's been allowed, subject to the extensive divestitures. The other thing that was really interesting about this press release was it was just music to the ACCC's ears, because it's been trying to get a mandatory notification system in relation to mergers, a suspensory regime. And a merger like this is just the reasons why they need this law. And the ACCC didn't miss an opportunity to really bang on about that issue. So as you can see, Gina Cascott saying under the formal system we have at the moment, companies can just go ahead and do mergers. And here's an example. They can just go and do all these mergers, lessen competition. The implication being that, if you acquire market power illegally, you're going to start overcharging customers or underservicing them, and customers are going to lose money. So the argument here is that maybe many customers of, these particular products have been ripped off for a few years, and the ACCC was unable to do anything about it because they didn't know. And as you can see, third paragraph, the ACCC is concerned there might be other mergers happening in the market that they're unaware of that are less in competition. We were lucky to find out about this one, but we can't know about the other ones because nobody's told us. So this is why we need the new laws. We need a mandatory suspensory regime like all the other major OECD countries, which is sort of a bit ironic because we're sort of excluding the UK and New Zealand when we say that, who also have voluntary schemes. But this is a really strong argument, which I'm sure the ACCC will be pushing to Treasury in relation to consultation to say why the law needs to change. There could be many of these mergers out there which the ACCC are not going to find out about, so consumers are going to suffer detriment. And even when they do find out about them, they're not going to be able to necessarily fix up the detriment that's occurred over a few years since the merger occurred. The next merger was Viva Energy OTR, and this was always going to get through. This involved Viva buying OTR, which runs a number of Coles Express sites. And it was a concern because in South Australia, these would have been the 2 biggest providers of these services. But there was an agreement to divest a number of stores in South Australia, and that was to ameliorate the anti-competitive effects. And as you can see through the public consultation on the divestiture, the number of stores to be divested increased from 23 to 25, so they sold most of the business in Adelaide. And they also have a approved purchaser, so Chevron has been approved as the purchaser of these 25 sites. and that will allow the merger to go ahead. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's an exchange deal being done. So Viva will transfer 25 sites to Chevron, and Chevron will transfer 13 sites based in Queensland, New South Wales, and WA to Viva. So that's an interesting element to this particular divestiture. I imagine there'll be an extra cash component, but there won't be any need to really for this to be monitored too closely, because Chevron's been approved as a purchaser. The next one's another concern by the ACCC about an Endeavour purchase, and this relates to I think I might have had the wrong name there. I don't know if it's Princess or Prince Consort. I think it might be Prince. But effectively, it's a hotel that operates in Brisbane's Fortitude Valley, and it operates a drive-through liquor store, Prince Cellars. And the ACCC is very concerned about this one, because only really 3 providers of takeaway liquor in Fortitude Valley, and the 2 other ones are both BWS, which are owned by Endeavour, and they're within 300 metres of Prince Cellars, so they're obviously competing quite closely. And so they seem to have quite strong concerns about this particular merger. Again, like the Rye Hotel, it might come down to a couple of factors. A, whether Prince Cellars are a vigorous competitor in the market, or whether they're really not competing on price and range and everything else. Other thing is whether they get the evidence to oppose it. That's really important. I think with Gina Cascott-Lee, there'll be a strong emphasis on A, is it a breach in economic terms, and B, can we prove it with evidence? This one was always going to get opposed. I think I predicted that in the last merger. It's interesting because Australian Clinical Labs and Healius were 2 of the 3 biggest providers of pathology services in the country, and the ACCC issued a statement of concerns which identified a lot of concerns, and they proposed a divestiture which really didn't address those concerns, so it was always bound to fail. The ACCC concluded that this was going to reduce substantially lesser competition in a number of markets: outpatient pathology services, private hospital inpatient pathology services, and commercial pathology services, which is pretty much everything. If they'd combined, they would have operated more than 50% of all approved pathology collection centres. They were concerned that it would impact negatively patients, referring doctors. And these are kind of things that businesses will do if they're economically rational. If they have market power, they'll do such things as, a longer turnaround time, shorter collection centre opening hours, it saves money, reduce support for medical practitioners, increase prices via higher private billing. So not saying that they had a blueprint to do all these things, but if you have market power, you will do these things because they're economically rational. The ACCC didn't think that the competitors, Foresight and Sonic, and public sector providers could expand quickly enough to constrain the market power of the merged entity. Also, new entry is very difficult, so that wasn't going to be a constraint. They noted there's significant incumbency advantages in pathology services. I guess just being approved, being reputable, having the track record, that's all very important. So new entrants are going to take a while to establish that. And the divestiture package was not capable of addressing the ACCC concerns, and that was always the case. They didn't address a lot of the concerns of the ACCC. Interesting thing here is Healius's share price really tanked after the merger was announced. And so it really wasn't looking like a very good acquisition for Australian Clinical Labs. So I think they might be quite happy they obviously opposed this, because they quickly said they weren't going to pursue the merger anymore. There wasn't going to be a challenge to the ACCC's decision. So this might be one of these mergers where Australian Clinical Labs has dodged a bullet by the ACCC opposition, not had to buy a company that was going backwards. Now, there was one announcement on scams. This was just before Christmas, and clearly it was about these delivery scams. I think we've all seen these emails and texts telling us that there's a delivery that's been held up and we need to click on the link. And so the ACCC is warning people about those particular scams. They're very prevalent and I imagine quite successful. And the advice is effectively don't click on any links in any texts or emails. Go to the site where the parcel is supposed to be, the reputable site of the delivery company, and check there. So I guess it's just a warning for people, particularly coming up to Christmas, not to get too excited about their Christmas present arriving, and click the link in a text. Inquiries and consultations, a lot of work in this area, so I'll try and go through pretty quickly, but it's just amazing how much the ACCC is turning out. The first was social media influencers. They've been looking at this area and they did a sweep of various sites. They swept 118 social media influencer sites and didn't realise there were that many. And they found that 81% of those sites appear to be making misleading representations. And the two major misrepresentations related to relationships with various brands. So they weren't disclosing the brand relationships on the post. And secondly, they're using vague or confusing language to disclose where they did have some relationships. So they're using the words SP and SPON, which is very surprising how bad the results were, given that the social media influencers have to have known for many months now that they're under the microscope with ACCC, and it's strange they haven't done more to comply. There was the second annual insurance monitoring report was issued. This is really looking at prices in the northern parts of Australia, and unfortunately it showed that both home, strata and small business insurance premiums were still much more expensive in the north of Australia compared to the rest of Australia, and in fact they'd gone up since the last report, so that's not very promising. The government's responded partially to the problems up there by setting up this new cyclone reinsurance pool, and that's hoping to ameliorate some of the impacts of the insurance premiums up there, but it's early days for the insurance pool and insurers are still joining, so maybe by the next report there'll be more positive news to report on. The next one was the fuel prices. So this September quarterly petrol monitoring report. And again, not great news. Both petrol and diesel prices had gone up in the period. And in relation to petrol, it was due to the OPEC cartel cutting production, stronger global demand, and the Aussie dollar being a bit weak. In relation to diesel, it was again due to the cartel, cutting production costs, but also a shortage of refining capacity around the world. So there are a few factors. And so we know that there's not necessarily price gouging happening in the Australian market. It's really reflecting international influences. The broadband measuring report came out, and again, this is good news because it showed that the speeds that consumers are achieving in both urban and regional areas have improved. And so, as you can see in the urban areas, it's increasing. This is download speeds up to 99% from 96.8. So that's a pretty significant improvement. But I think more importantly, in regional areas, it's up to 97.2 from 94.2. So that's a really good outcome that the speeds have been improving in the regional areas. Stevedoring, this is a very controversial report, the container stevedoring report. This is interesting because this was brought in, the ACCC, the government kicked in lots of redundancies into the industry and then started monitoring prices. And it seemed to me that the container companies just kicked a lot of edit costs into the other areas that weren't being monitored, such as the transportation of containers before and after arrival at port. But here it showed that the operating profit margins for the container stevedoring industry had increased to 24.9%, which is a pretty good margin given the work that they're doing. And this is just going up and up and up. And the problem here is there are two new entrants to the market, Hutchison and VICT, who don't appear to be exercising any constraint on the incumbent stevedores. So there's a couple of reasons for that. I guess the most obvious reason to me is there's a fully functioning oligopoly in the industry. They're just copying each other's prices. Prices, at least for some of the work that they do, is quite transparent. It's very easy for people to follow prices up. So I think there's an oligopoly. I think most elements of unfortunately, of our supply chain at the ports are broken, from the unions to the stevedores to the tugs, you name it, line of shipping arrangements. It's not a super competitive production chain. But there was other issues that ACCC identified. Firstly, they were saying that shipping lines are contributing to the problem because they're preferencing the same stevedore across multiple ports, which means you're going to be preferencing the incumbents, DP World and Patrick, because they're the only ones who have facilities in every port. So that's preventing the the new entrants getting work. There needs to be more transparency in relation to the pricing, particularly stevedoring pricing and empty container park operator pricing. And they're also concerned about what they describe as unreasonable detention fees. So importers importers and exporters are getting hit with unreasonable detention fees. Often they're being incurred through the fact that they can't return the container through factors outside their control, and they're being slugged with penalties. So ACCC wants some action in relation to that. I don't know how that's going to manifest itself. The gas inquiry report came out. This is, again, maybe some good news. The forecasts showed that there'd be balanced supply and demand in 2024 if Queensland's LNG producers export all their currently uncontracted gas. So there'll be a 71 petajoule surplus. So that's if nothing funny occurs. They note that the supply of gas in 2024 will be sufficient over the east coast. The main concern here is that there's a lot of gas in Queensland and much less in the southern states. So it's a question of transporting gas from Queensland down south, and there's new pipelines which facilitate that. So really, if the gas can come down from the north to the south, there won't be any shortfalls over the next winter. The retail deposits inquiry report, and this is a final report, but it was very interesting and quite controversial, and I think there'll be pressure on the government to continue the ACCC's mandate to report on this area. But they noted that the consumers are missing out on higher interest savings due to barriers to entry, barriers to switching between different accounts. So it's difficult to switch between different accounts to search out for the best interest available. The ACCC noted that banks are using strategic pricing, including introductory and bonus interest rates, and it's making it all very complex. So it's hard for consumers to compare products because the offerings are so complex. They also know that banks segment their customers through product design and conditional interest rates, leading to very big differences across comparable products. So that's again making it very hard for consumers to have the information they need to switch and find the best product. Also, they were talking about bonus interest that accounts, and they're noting that most consumers don't actually get the bonus interest, and they're saying there 71% of the bonus interest accounts did not receive bonus interest. So consumers aren't able to comply with the rules to get the bonus interest, and so they're missing out. So the ACCC made a few recommendations to government. Firstly, that banks be required to tell the customers when they change their interest rates and actually prompt the customer to consider switching. So that's not something the banks are going to want to do. Also, banks alert their customers if they're about to lose their entitlement to interest, bonus interest. So tell them, unless you keep a balance up to such and such in your account for the next week or so, you're not going to get the bonus interest. So that'll help customers to work out when they need to leave the money in the account. And finally, I guess this is a bit of a go at the government. The government should consider further bank account portability. So this is a consumer data right which has been put on hold by the current government after a review, and I think they're saying that really needs to be picked up and progressed. Electricity market inquiry report. This is again bad news. You can see there's mixed reviews, but primarily I think these reviews are showing bad news in a number of markets. Here they're saying that obviously makes sense. Electricity retailers offer cheaper plans to attract new customers, but what happens is they win a customer over, and over time those plans become more expensive, and so loyal customers are actually being charged more. And this is based on consumer inertia. They know consumers, once they hook up to an electricity supplier, probably just say that's done and don't continue to look at plans and move when it gets too expensive. The other thing that's problematic is this movement by a lot of consumers to market offers. Market offers are supposed to be cheaper because they reflected market factors, and there was default rate, which is like a safety net. So a lot of consumers moved to market rates, which were cheaper than default rate, but over time the market rates have actually increased. So what the ACCC is finding here, that a lot of residential consumers are on market rates which are more expensive than default rate, which is just pretty bizarre. So what the ACCC is trying to do is encourage people to look at their electricity plans and maybe move to default rate because it'll save money. So as you can see, market offers have increased significantly more than default offers. 47% of residential consumers have an annual cost higher than default offer, which doesn't make sense, because why would you be in a market rate that's costing you more than just sitting on the default rate? They also refer to these legacy market offers, which have these large conditional discounts pay on time and so on, and finding that most consumers can never don't achieve prices significantly less than the default offer, even if they achieve all the discounts offered. So that suggests the products aren't designed very well, and the level of retail competition, the NEM, has stalled for small businesses. So it's not a very promising outlook in the market. There was a warning issued to franchisors and telling them to remove unfair contract terms or risk getting sued. And the ACCC conducted a review of a number of franchising agreements and found a number of terms which they believe are unfair. And the two major areas, or well, two major concerns expressed were a lot of these terms didn't appear to be reasonably necessary to protect the franchisor's legitimate business interests, and also they identified concerns with unilateral variation clauses, withholding, set-off payment clauses, order power clauses, restraint of trades, termination clauses, and so on. And I'd probably support the ACCC on this because I do a little bit of work advising franchisees on franchise agreements, and I don't know how many times I've come across terms which are unfair, even post the November 2023 changes. And I say to the franchisor, this is an unfair term, you've got to get rid of it, and they just don't take any notice of me, basically. So I advise the client that, if they ever seek to enforce this term, it's likely to be unfair and as such unenforceable. For example, this is a very common clause. Often there's a term saying that the franchisee has to provide a personal guarantee for the franchise agreement, and it says that the personal guarantee is enforceable even if the franchise agreement is found to be unenforceable. And I say, well, that can't be right. That can't work, because if the franchise agreement's unenforceable, then the personal guarantee is going to be unenforceable as well. And I've raised that with a number of franchisors, including some big ones, and they just refuse to change it. And I explained the basic contract law around that, and they just don't listen to me. So this is a big area. There's going to be some litigation in this area, because I think franchisors are just being very, resistant to listening to anybody who's telling them they've got a problem and not making changes. There was so here's some tips that the ACCC provided to franchisors to avoid getting done for unfair contract terms, and it's basic advice. Consider both points of view. Include counterbalancing terms. If there's an unfair term in your favour and an unfair term in the other side's favour, they sort of balance each other out. Avoid broad terms. Meet your obligation on ACL. Don't exclude ACL liability. That's fundamental. Be clear. Be transparent. Now, one guideline was finalised in December. This is environmental guidelines, and ACCC put out a guideline for discussion, received quite a lot of feedback about it, and the purpose of this guide is to assist businesses to make clear, evidence-based environmental claims which consumers can understand and trust. And the pretty basic advice, really, the key principles are: make accurate, truthful claims, have evidence to back up your claims, because you can get hit with a substantiation notice by the ACCC. Don't hide or omit important information. Explain any conditions or qualifications on your claims. Avoid broad and unqualified claims. Use clear and easy to understand language. Visual elements should not give the wrong impression. That's really important. Don't have lots of images of, landscapes and the sea and the moon and stuff like that, because people do put a lot of weight on those images. And be direct and open about your sustainability transition. So that's a important guideline for, I think, all business to have a look at and follow. There have been a couple of legislative proposals we've been kicking around, and the ACCC has issued a couple of press releases discussing those. The first is the Australian Government in principle agreement to the various changes to the laws in relation to digital platforms, which they recommended in their 2022 September report. And I think it's fair to say that it's a bit lukewarm. I expected the government to be a little bit more enthusiastic about these changes. When they say in principle, that gives them a lot of wiggle room, maybe not to go ahead and do things. So I was a bit surprised at that. The government's indicated a willingness to address consumer harms caused by scams, harmful apps, and fake reviews. So that's the more obvious area where the ACCC is unlikely to have any concerns. They're going to be requesting digital platforms to develop voluntary internal dispute resolution standards. So it's a request initially, just give them opportunity to do their own internal system, and if that doesn't work, maybe introduce a mandatory system. And they're committed to introduce mandatory industry codes for industries, including digital communication platforms, to address scams. So they are committed to some mandatory industry codes, but it's not clear which ones. The ACCC were proposing quite extensive mandatory industry codes for different industry areas, including all sorts of consumer and competition law obligations. So a comprehensive scheme. The government seems to have not really shown its hand in terms of how far it's going to go with that. Clearly the best approach, like this is the most targeted, sensible approach to regulating digital platforms, I think. It's very principled. Then they also issued a press release talking about the consultation paper put out by the Treasury on the merger reforms, and they reiterated the fact they don't have the tools to prevent anti-competitive mergers taking place. Some can slip under the radar, e.g. Petstock. The lack of requirement to tell the ACCC about mergers makes us a bit of an outlier, although an outlier with the UK and New Zealand. And they dismissed two of the options. There's three options put in the paper. The ACCC option, the second option is compulsory to notify the ACCC of mergers, but then the federal court work it out, which the ACCC don't really like that idea. They want it to be them and the Competition Tribunal, and making it just voluntary for parties to notify the ACCC, which is sort of the status quo. So here the ACCC is going hard on this issue. I attended a consultation with Treasury, and I can't comment on too much because it was subject to confidentiality. But I guess the Treasury seemed to be canvassing all the issues, and it'd be interesting to see what they come down with. I'd be really surprised if they left the status quo. I think ultimately they will go with the ACCC proposal. I think it makes a lot of sense. Even if Treasury don't like that option, I think the government will opt for that. Now, there was a speech, and this was about competition stewardship in markets transforming for environmental sustainability. And that's a very big issue globally. The ACCC probably hasn't done as much work here as, say, the Europeans have, but it's not just consumer law, but it's also competition law. So obviously the ACCC making environmental sustainability a priority is part of it, but the bigger issue probably is whether companies are allowed to coordinate to progress environmentally sustainable outcomes, and obviously weighing up the competition detriments with the environmental benefits or the public benefits. And so here they're talking about how they've made sustainability a priority, that they are looking at market coordination in pursuit of sustainability. And I guess the Origin Energy Brookfield merger is probably the best example where they weighed up competition and public benefits and decided to allow the merger based on public benefit arguments in relation to environmental sustainability and taking a responsive compliance approach to environmental sustainability. So this is clearly in the mergers context, but more likely in authorisations where the ACCC approves an arrangement or a merger based on environmental factors, even though there might be some anti-competitive detriment. So this is a big area. I think the ACCC needs to get maybe moving a bit on some compliance guidance on the competition issues around environmental sustainability. Now, one other matter related to cash in transit, and a few months ago there was this merger permitted between Armaguard and the Spanish company, can't really Prosegur, I think they're called, and effectively it was a case where the merger was allowed primarily because there was a belief that there'd be market failure, that a competitor would exit the market and leave a sole provider. The bigger concern is that nobody does this work and there's nobody to transfer cash in the market, which would be pretty disastrous for a lot of businesses. So it seems that the merger didn't necessarily resolve the problems. It says that Armaguard is not sustainable in its current form. So it's so urgent that the banks and the Australian Banking Association approach the ACCC for an interim authorisation to allow them to get together and talk about possible solutions going forward. I think the most likely thing is the banks kicking some money into the industry to keep it going. So maybe they backwardly vertically integrate, set up a new company to manage cash in transit going forward. So that's probably the most likely outcome. So there'll be some discussions between the ABA and banks and Armour Guard, and they'll have to come forward with a proposal. But I suspect it'll be setting up maybe a joint venture company and owned by the banks to operate this going forward. Now, just a commentary. It was a very busy month. So much was completed in December. I guess the main thing you notice is a lot of enforcement actions are being resolved by consent. Other enforcement actions are being resolved through undertakings, infringement notices. The ACCC isn't wanting to get embroiled in long court cases, particularly against smaller businesses. They're wanting to resolve those and move on. A lot of mergers were signed off in December. Seemed to be a bit of a clearing of the decks, and I think maybe the new year we'll see some very big cases coming along. There'll be some big merger changes probably, and maybe they're also clearing the decks for the digital platforms area, where if the government agrees to preparing these industry codes, there's going to be a lot of work for the ACCC. So a lot of things have been knocked over in December. It's a real high level of work in the inquiry and consultation work, and very good work showing some significant problems in various industries, making recommendations for resolution. So that's really important work, and I can't see that getting quieting down. I think that'll be increasing going forward. The ACCC does a really good job there. The government response in relation to digital reforms was, in my view, somewhat lukewarm. I didn't expect them to be sitting on the fence so much, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Clearly, I think the ACCC's proposals make a lot of sense, and I think the government should get full behind them. And the Treasury response in the merger is hard to read. Again, I can't comment on the consultations, but it's not really too sure where they sit. I think there might be maybe disconnect between what Treasury thinks and what the government thinks. I think the government is pretty well behind these merger reform changes, and I think they'll bring them in. So that's all I had. It was a very busy month, and unfortunately it's taken 45 minutes instead of the usual 30, but I guess there's a lot to be covered, and I expect that when January comes around, I'll be back to the normal. So if you have any questions about this, feel free to give me a call or send me an email. Bye-bye.